Elemental Shamans have a massive problem going into Midnight. Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and I've mained Elemental Shaman now for the past 4 years, and for the first time since I picked up the spec way back in Dragonflight, I might not be maining it come Midnight. Also, I put timestamps in the video, so if there's anything that specifically interests you, you can skip ahead to any part, but I do suggest you watch the whole thing. Now look, I know that the title sounds like clickbait, and I also know that we're WoW players, so we are absolutely famous for being calm, reasonable people who never overreact to anything that Blizzard does. But to be super upfront, this video is not doomposting. I'm not trying to farm negativity or act like the spec is dead like other people on the internet. I generally love the spec, and it's my favorite class by far. And honestly, the War Within was the best the class has ever been in since I started it back in Dragonflight. Which is exactly why I'm worried moving into Midnight. Everything I'm going to talk about is purely my perspective as someone who plays this spec a lot and cares about where it's going. But I know not everyone's going to share my thoughts, so while you're watching, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Okay, before we get too deep, let's talk about where Elemental Shaman actually is in the War Within. The best way I can describe Ellie is it's super fast-paced, bursty, and reactive. You're not just mindlessly pressing the same buttons on cooldown, you're constantly reacting to what the game is giving you. Your entire gameplay loop is basically built around procs. You've got your deeply rooted elements proccing your Ascendance every so often, you've got your Tempest procs, and then you've got your free lightning bolts and chain lightnings, and then you've got your Aftershock procs refunding Maelstrom. All of that creates a really fun and rewarding playstyle where the spec just explodes in this super satisfying burst window where you're machine gunning out chain lightnings and earthquakes, and then all of a sudden you go from the bottom of the DPS to the top. It feels like you're constantly being rewarded for paying attention and reacting well to those procs instead of just following a fixed priority list. And for me at least, this is the first time in a long time where Elemental actually feels like it has real gameplay identity, which is why what's coming in Midnight is so concerning to me. The biggest change to the spec is it is much more slower paced than it's been in the past, and a huge part of that is due to the removal of deeply rooted elements. Without DRE proccing Ascendance, you lose that constant reactive gameplay loop, which leads to the next big shift that the rotation becomes way more fixed. In Midnight, the spec is still super bursty during Ascendance, but now it is purely cooldown based burst. There is no pop-off moments anymore, it's just big damage on your usual 2 to 3 minute cooldown usage. But even in Ascendance, the gameplay loop doesn't really change all that much. You're still hitting the same buttons in the same order, they just hit harder. So instead of reacting to procs and adjusting on the fly, you're basically just playing a scripted rotation, waiting for your cooldowns to come back up, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is a massive shift from the class identity as it existed in the War Within. But to be fair, there is some good here as well, mainly being Voltaic Blaze, and the ability for us to finally say goodbye to Liquid Magma Totem for good. It feels way better to press, fits into the kit way more cleanly, and just makes Flame Shocks feel less janky overall, which is a genuine win. But there are also 2 more changes I wanted to mention last because they have been a heavily debated and arguably the most heavily debated topics in the Elemental community for a long time, being Echoes of the Great Sundering and Ice Fury. Both of these have been removed, which means Elemental Weaving is pretty much dead. This is part in what makes your rotation extremely simplified and extremely fixed. There's just numerically less buttons to hit, and with the change of the small modifier buffs like Master the Element and Elemental Equilibrium, our rotation is pretty much just 4 buttons over and over again. Now, while I personally grew to love Ice Fury and Echoes, I can at least agree that they were awkward and generally messy talents to use, so I can agree that getting rid of them was probably the right option moving forward to make the spec more approachable. But now that we've talked about the differences, it's time to talk about the core problems going into Midnight, and it pretty much all revolves around Ascendance and the removal of deeply rooted elements. DRE was the single most important talent in the entire build, not because of just the raw damage it gave you, but because of how it made the spec feel to play and the gameplay it opened up. Those random Ascendance procs were what made the rotation exciting. You'd be sitting there in the middle of the pull doing your normal thing, and then suddenly Ascendance would proc, and everything would just pop off for the next few seconds. More importantly, it made Ascendance being a 3-minute cooldown and one of the few remaining 3-minute DPS cooldowns in the game actually tolerable. DRE was the thing that made that design work. It smoothed out the gameplay, gave you little mini burst windows between your cooldowns, and made the spec feel more reactive instead of entirely scripted. Sure, you can spend a talent point to make it a 2-minute cooldown, but it came at the cost of a significantly weaker version which never felt good to choose. With DRE gone, all of that amazing feeling gameplay disappears, which is where Ascendance completely falls apart as a mechanic. Ascendance has been the core identity of Elemental Shaman for years, and everything that the spec has been built around, but going into Midnight, it doesn't really feel all that good to press anymore. Outside of Ascendance, you're just pressing the same few buttons over and over and over and over again, but even in Ascendance, your gameplay really rarely changes. You're still pressing the same buttons, following the exact same order, your spells just hit a bit harder. So it doesn't feel like there's this massive pop-off moment anymore, it just feels like a damage amp on a 3-minute timer. And without DRE randomly injecting that excitement into the rotation, you're now literally waiting 2 to 3 minutes just to press a cooldown that barely changes your rotation or gameplay. And now is where I talk about the Apex talents, which makes this whole thing sound so much worse. Apex talents were supposed to be these big, fun, gameplay-defining talents going into Midnight, but for Elemental, they basically just made our mastery a little bit more powerful. Ascendance gets nerfed going into Midnight, DRE gets removed, and then the Apex talents come in and say, okay, here, have some of the power that we just took away back. So instead of feeling like we got something new and exciting, it feels like we're spending our most important talent points to just undo changes Blizzard just made, which makes it a horrible feeling to have to pick up. Your capstone, expansion-defining talents should make you feel powerful, more interesting, and more fun to play. They shouldn't feel like a tax to pay to get you back to the baseline where we were just at in the War Within. So now your big core identifying cooldown is weaker than it used to be, the proc that used to make it way more exciting is gone, and the big new talents that were supposed to be gameplay defining is there just to patch up the damage that Blizzard just made in the new patch. This makes the entire design of the class feel backwards. Instead of Midnight adding something cool to Elemental, it feels like it's just taking things away and then charging you talent points to get them back. And speaking of talent points, let's talk about Voltaic Blaze. From pure gameplay perspective, Voltaic Blaze is a massive win, but it does have a rather large problem no one seems to be talking about. While it is a great idea and a fantastic change from Liquid Magma Totem, the way it was implemented makes absolutely no sense because it actually used the spell properly. It effectively costs 4 entire talent points. And all 4 of these talent points come at the very bottom of your spec tree. So you're not just paying a huge tax to access the one fun new button the spec got, but you're also completely locking yourself into this rigid path to access it, which makes the exact problem we've already been talking about much worse. Your gameplay is already slower, your rotation is super simplistic, and your talents already feel like they're just patching holes instead of adding new gameplay, and now the one actual new spell that we got that makes the spec feel a bit fresher and more modern is locked behind one of the most expensive talent investments in not just the spec, but the entire game. So instead of Voltaic Blaze feeling like this exciting new addition to the kit, it feels like a consolation prize that you only get if you're willing to give up a bunch of other meaningful options. But I want to stop here so I can be really clear about my actual problem with the spec going into Midnight. It's not that Blizzard wants the spec to be slower, it's not that they want it to be more simple, and it's not even that they're moving away from proc-heavy reactive gameplay, because I can live with all of that. Those are design philosophy choices, and whether you personally like them or not, which I obviously don't, that doesn't make them automatically wrong. The real problem is how they implemented those changes, because in the process of simplifying the spec, they didn't just trim the awkward talents or clean up the rotational bloat, they removed the depth, the reactivity, and the things that made the class feel dynamic and alive, and in doing that, they completely shifted Elemental's class identity. In the War Within, Elemental was built around procs, burst windows, and reacting to what the game gave you. In Midnight, that identity is entirely gone. Instead, what we're left with is a spec that's built around a 3-minute cooldown that barely changes how you play, a flattened rotation where you press the same buttons on repeat, and a talent tree that feels less like cool choices and more like a gameplay tax in a subscription-based game. And that does not feel good. Your spec tree shouldn't feel like a tax form where you're just trying to get back to baseline functionality. It should feel like you're adding power, flavor, and new gameplay into a class that you already enjoy playing. And that's why this all worries me so much, because I love the spec, and I don't want the reason I stopped maining the class to be I stopped having fun. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to put out there. Like I said earlier, I know not everyone's going to agree with me on this, and that's totally fine, so I'd honestly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How are you feeling about the spec in the War Within, and how are you feeling about it going into Midnight? Am I completely off base, or am I right on the money? Let me know in the comments below. And yes, I know that I just spent this entire video explaining why I might not even main this class in Midnight, but I did make a video for pre-patch if you're interested and you're still planning to play it in the pre-patch and Midnight going forward, so you can go check that out, links in the description. And finally, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more WoW content to come. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.